Okay, take two. This is another judging video. It's about test day standards, and it's, as I said in the previous video, it's not really judges that go to test day, it's evaluators, which is a slightly different promotional process. So I want people to I'm going to do a video later, well, right after this, but somewhere on this YouTube site, under test day, where I'm going to explain kind of how I decide what the test standards should be and are for a test day, and how I decide whether to pass or fail, or whether to put up a test on test day or not, or whether to take it out. To really, I like to think it's simple, but most people will probably think I've overly complicated it, which is not actually true. You have to take into account dozens and dozens of factors in order to get accurate results. And I think it's very simple. I totally get it. But I have to start with judging standards on testing. So, average pass standard. Oh, I should say pass. So one axis. I'm sure people have yelled at me for not labeling my axes right. And I'm going to do this basically the same way I did it before in all my other videos. This is kind of the way I view everything, where I kind of do things on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, the problem is there's two different ways that judges do their standard. And I'm going to mainly deal with the second, but I can't really do that until I introduce the first one, which is a little bit more complicated. So there are several disciplines in skating, several testing disciplines, 4 really, currently. There used to be more, now there's only 4. Skills, which is being phased out at some point. Free skate, which is jumps and spins, mainly what you see on TV. Dances, which is guy and girl dancing together. And interpretives, which is kind of a solo that you do. It's more what you see in an ice show, Stars on Ice, Ice Capades, except not really, that's a show program, but an interpretive is a solo where you utilize the music more, be more creative and artistic, and you have no requirement for jumps or spins in it usually, or very minimal requirements for jumps or spins, whereas in a free skate solo you have to have a bunch of jumps and spins to get your points. Yes. So these are 4 different disciplines. Now, one of the things you have to notice with coaches is, I guess, judges, is there's 3 different, I said there was 2, but I think there's 3. Well, let's do one first. So I got a little anecdote, obviously. There are evaluators. I'm going to call them judges the whole video. I just can't get into the habit of calling them evaluators. There are judges that are tougher on different disciplines than others because they're either more knowledgeable, therefore tougher, or more knowledgeable and therefore easier because they know how hard it is. Often ignorance breeds the most toughest judges. The ones who tend to be more and more knowledgeable tend to have, no, I wouldn't say easy, but they tend to be closer to the reasonable average 5 range, whereas when they're a little bit ignorant or something, they can scoot up a bit and or down, but the more knowledgeable they are, they don't tend to get terribly easy. They tend to level out at the normal, regular 5. And we're assuming that 5 is normal, regular, whatever that happens to be. So the anecdote I have is we had in Vermont for a couple of years, they were trying to bring tough judges in to show their coaches that they needed to do more to upgrade their education in skating, that they weren't being successful with tests. Which I thought was awesome. I thought that was really funny and interesting. Although having a board work against its coaches is a little bit, that would be, if I was actually one of their coaches at the time, it would have been a little bit, and I was later, and they were still doing it, but I was fine with it, I guess, because I don't like easy judges. I don't like judges that pass things that don't deserve to pass. That upsets me way more than judges that fail things that deserve to pass. Obviously, I'd rather neither happen, but it does. Both do. So we had a judge come in that was super, super hard. She was reputed to be super, super hard. And she had this big booklet, this huge binder where she had printed up all the dance and skills patterns. And she had put them in laminated plastic and then used a marker like this to mark little notes for herself on these patterns. And at one point in Labrador, as I usually do, I went up and talked to her and tried to get some sense of what she expected from tests, see if I could make any last-minute changes or adjustments or learn something from her. I tried to pick up something from most of the judges we had come in. And I can't remember if she was there or not or what the situation was, but at some point I got a hold of her book, and it was flipped open to one of the dance patterns, and she went through a couple of dance things with me at some point, I think. And I noticed that pretty typical attitude towards dance. She would have about 3 notes, 2, 3, 4 notes on the dance patterns where she would highlight a certain part of the dance and put a note in margins, make sure they don't wide set the mohawk, blah, 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 just little things. And generally her highlights were on all the right places where I consider the highlights to be. So, every dance has 2 or 3 hard things or feature things that you try to make sure is good. And if you can get that good, you can generally get the test to pass, whether the overall standard is good or not. I prefer the overall standard to be good, but it isn't always. Vice versa, if the overall standard is awesome and they're clearly able to pass the test, but one of those 3 features is, or all of them, are weak, or one of them is way off, they're not going to pass. Whether they clearly deserve to pass or not, they've got to have some of the specific techniques down to pass the dance. And her notes totally reflected that, totally reinforced my attitude towards dance. So I thought, okay, this is great, this is going to be no problem. Then at some point, she switched to a skills pattern. And immediately I was like, I started freaking out and looking at it because she had, on the average skills pattern, she had probably 15 to 20 highlighted notes on her skills patterns. And almost the entire way around the skills pattern, she had notes on things she was looking for and things she was expecting. And I thought, oh my God, nobody's going to pass their skills test. And I went out and told my kids that, don't have too much expectations for skills. This judge seems to have a lot of expectations for skills, but dances should be fine. And what ended up happening, she ended up coming twice, 2 or 3 times, I think. And her pass rate on skills tests was about 8 to 12%. She would fail 90% of the skills tests that went out, and some of them were fairly decent. Dance tests, my dance test, she was around 70-80% she passed, which is right about where I normally am anyway. Fairly normal on dances, but really, really tough on skills. And, my pass rate on all my tests, in fact, my skills pass rate generally, during the 10 years I was in Labrador, was higher than my dance pass rate. I was about 85% for skills, 75% for dance. So, and she passed all my free skate tests, which is normal. I usually am about 95-98% on free skate passes. But it was really interesting that just by looking at her book and opening her book, I could pretty much guess that she was going to be absolutely picky and brutal on free skate, on skills tests, and she was. Now, according to the other coaches, she was brutal on everything, but I have fairly high standards in everything else, and so I didn't really have any particular problem with her pass rate on any of the times she came, whether it was 2 or 3 times. It was just skills that when I knew she was the judge coming, and they told us in advance usually, I would just yank all my skills that weren't 150% ready to pass. So that's an interesting example of how judges, even among a single judge, can have consistent but wildly differentiating pass rates based on the discipline, which is something you have to factor in if you're aware of what the judges are. Now, the second thing you have to factor in is, I'll just go right to the last one. So let's say this is what you consider an average test for judges. Now, to me, there's 2 different factors when you look at judging expectations, judging standards. To me, a good judge is a judge that's fairly consistent with her standard across the board. I don't even care if she fluctuates between dance and skills, as long as if she has 10 kids doing the same skill in front of her, she maintains the same standard for all 10 kids and doesn't seem to pass a worse test and then fail a better test. This is my idea of a good judge. I don't really care how hard they are. I don't care how easy they are. I just want them to be consistent. not just within a test day, but from test day to test day and year to year. Now, judges are going to learn and improve and adjust and get better at judging over time, you would hope. So their standards are going to hopefully even out and maybe change a little bit harder and easier as they get feedback. But it should happen gradually enough that you can kind of chart the progress. Now, unfortunately, let's say you get an average judge. There's no such thing as a judge that goes as a 5 right across the board. What tends to happen is they, if you chart their difficulty on tests, it tends to be something like that. This would be a good judge. A good judge is right around 5. Maybe on a grumpy day, she goes down to a 4 and starts passing more tests. Maybe on a particularly other day, she goes up to 6 occasionally and passes a few tests. Fails a few more tests than she should have. But man, I keep forgetting to bring paper towel in here. I think I have some on the floor or something. All right, shirt again. So that's a good judge. That's a good average judge. A bad average judge is really kind of just all over the place. Where they're, I don't know if they'd fluctuate that much, but basically from one test to the next, you don't know if she's going to be failing everything or passing everything, and they will fluctuate from test day to test day, which makes it really, really hard as a coach to know what you should put in as a test, sort of. But you have to know that happens occasionally. Luckily, if you're lucky enough, you're slightly familiar with the judge, and you know whether that will happen. Now, those kind of judges that fluctuate, nobody fluctuates this much. That's crazy. But you can get people that will go pretty consistently from a 7 to a 3 to a 5 to a 6 to a 3, day to day, and I've definitely had coaches that from one test day to the next. I've had skaters that have skated good at a test day on a test, failed their test when maybe they shouldn't have, a little bit arguable, gray area, gone to the next test day with the same judge, let's say a month later, bombed it, done terribly, and passed the test. And that obviously should never happen. That's crazy. But to some extent, I almost think the judge maybe even subconsciously at the first test day was thinking about it and saying, geez, why didn't I pass that? I should have passed that. So at the next test day, they make up for their error. That's the only explanation I can have. I don't understand how else that can happen. But I've had that happen, I'm going to say, a few dozen occasions. And I've also obviously had tests where I've had 2 people go in for a test, one who's significantly better at everything than the other skater, and they skate normally. And the one who's significantly better at everything fails, and the one who is fairly poor at everything passes, which is, again, really, really weird. But one thing you have to remember with judges is a lot of the normal judges will judge tests 3, 4, 5 times a year. Every 2 or 3 months they're seeing skating. They might be going to 1 or 2 clinics a year. They might be upgrading online a couple times a year. So the amount of hours they put into understanding standards and skating and techniques and blah, 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 blah is, 1% what a coach would put in. Now, I'm not saying coaches should judge kids, because then you get way more into bias than you would with judges, as I've gone into in previous videos. But there is definitely a questionable, if you're not inundated by the standards on a regular basis several times a week, several hours a week, things can slide from test day to test day. You can forget things. You can change your standards. You can alter without even knowing about it from test day to test day. Anyway, I should go back to this. This is going to happen in my next video. So if it's 5 is what the average test in, I actually don't like judges who are around a 5. I would much rather judges who are around a 6, 6.5, or 7. This is my ideal line right here. It's actually fill in the y-axis there. I'd rather be here, a judge be there, because it's hard to explain that. Can I explain that in this video? No, I don't think I can. So I won't bother. Ideal, in case anybody wonders what that says. Well, I can tell you why, I guess, briefly. If a judge is a 5, a lot of coaches really try to push tests forwards a lot, and they don't really care if the tests fail occasionally. So they'll try to lower the test standard on a regular basis by putting tests in that are at or slightly below standard to see if they can pressure the judges into passing them and making it look like their skaters are progressing better and faster than they are. And judges over time will subconsciously succumb to that. If people are constantly putting in bad tests, the judges will eventually start passing them. It's impossible to resist that kind of subterfuge, that kind of subtle subliminal messaging. So I love it when a judge comes in with a 7 standard because my tests still do pretty good. I'll get about an 80, 85, 90% pass rate, and they will. There are some coaches out there who will have virtually all their tests fail. Whereas here at 50%, all my tests will pass. Great, wonderful. But a whole lot of tests from other coaches will pass too. Not all of them. As I said, they are constantly pushing this boundary, trying to get it down. But more than I think should pass. And it's not really reflective enough of how good my standards are, how good the execution of my skaters is when the judge is around a 5. That has nothing to do with judging. Why am I bringing this up in this video? Anyway, so like I said, from test day to test day, if a judge is around here, I will say, if a judge starts creeping up around 8, I put 10 and 1 in. I've never met a judge that's a 10 or a 9. I've met a couple that I would call an 8, and they generally fail a lot of the tests they see, a lot of them unreasonably. And what ends up happening there is if you have judges that come in at an 8 all the time, as a coach, especially if you have kids skating 2 days a week, they're just never going to test, or they're never going to pass a test. And as a coach, I would stop putting in tests until they're at that 8 standard, which can take that amount of fine tuning, that amount of strength, that amount of execution. It just takes way too much effort, more effort than is reasonable to expect from a skater. Skaters have to be able to progress to a certain level, and sometimes that's you don't want to have such tough standards that you continually fail things. Now, you shouldn't continually fail things because your coach should be safeguarding your confidence and not putting in tests that they think are possibly going to fail over and over and over again, although some coaches don't do that. But anyway, it's not the greatest video on judging standards and probably shouldn't have gone 20 minutes. And it's going to overlap a lot with my next video. But that's it. That's what I... Well, I guess as a final note, how you could look at this is 10 is a perfect test and 1 is an absolutely horrid test. Now, you don't expect tests to be perfect. Maybe at a gold level, close to perfect, but you should never have to be up here. Every once in a while, you'll get a test that, because the kid sometimes goes through rapid improvement or starts skating more or had to delay on tests for a while, they might get up near a 10, but the judging standard should never be a 10, and isn't. I've never seen it as a 10. I have seen it at 1s occasionally, where people doing the wrong steps, the wrong concept, the wrong execution, have still managed to scrape through tests. I've actually had people, I think two or three times, I've had a lot of tests will say minimum pass standard, blah, blah, blah. Like, for instance, in the old days, like 5 years ago, they used to have competitive tests where you had to land certain jumps to pass the test. Like minimum standard for juvenile, you had to land 2 double jumps. Junior, you had to land a double axel. That didn't exist for a long time, but even with the you have to land a double axel for junior, I witnessed 3 or 4 junior tests where the kid didn't land a double axel, didn't come close to landing a double axel, and passed the test, which clearly shouldn't happen. I don't even know if I'd call that a 1. I might call that below a 1. And I don't quite get that, but anyway, that kind of stuff happens. Again, human error. Bye.